I'm going to introduce you as our Executive Director, I think, and we are now recording.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being here at NCHE's Equity Summit. We're just delighted at how many educators and history enthusiasts have been joining us from across the country. We've really been pretty astounded by the response, but I think we shouldn't be, because we knew that there was a real need on the part of educators to engage with experts. In the wake of the killing of George Floyd at NCHE, we felt like we needed to do something, but at the same time, you all as educators started contacting us and saying, how do we teach race? How do we teach racism? What do we do in the wake of this? How do we act? Because that civic action piece is so important to all of us as educators. And so what we realized we needed to do was to convene experts. And also to have conversations amongst ourselves as educators and talk about this. How do we do this better? So we are just so delighted to have Hasan Jeffries here with us today as our first keynote speaker. We are going to be having lots of wonderful speakers throughout this summit. We hope you can join us for everything, but even if you just pop in throughout the next couple days, we'll be delighted to have you. So just a huge thank you to all of you who are attending right now, educators who are doing this important work, and a huge thank you to Hasan for being here.
Thank you.
Let me get my audio. There we go.
Awesome. Should I?
There we go. I couldn't get my video to come on, and I didn't want to just be the disembodied voice. So I'm Laura Wakefield. I'm the program coordinator for NCHE, the National Council for History Education, and we're just delighted to have Hasan Jeffries as our keynote speaker today. Hasan Kwame Jeffries is Associate Professor of History at The Ohio State University, where he has been teaching courses on the Civil Rights and Black Power movement for the last 18 years. He earned a BA in History from Morehouse College in 1994 and a PhD in American History with a specialization in African American history from Duke University in 2002. He's the author of Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt. Most recently, he edited Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, a book of essays by leading civil rights scholars on how to teach the civil rights movement. He also wrote and narrated the 10-episode Audible original series, Great Figures of the Civil Rights Movement, which was released in February 2020. In the classroom, he's won several major teaching awards, including the Ohio State University Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching, the university's highest award for teaching. Dr. Jeffries has also worked on several public history projects, including serving as the lead historian for the 5-year, $25 million renovation of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. He's also the host of the podcast Teaching Hard History, American Slavery, which is a production of the Teaching Tolerance Division of the which just wrapped up its 2nd season. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to you and let you share your slides and begin. Thank you. You are muted, it looks like. Let me make sure that.
I
yes.
got it. That was on me. Okay. I got it. Okay. You would think by now I would have figured that out, but such is the way it is. Yeah. We share my slides and we'll get to going. Well, thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate it. And of course, Grace, thank you so much for extending the invitation on behalf of National Council for History Education to be a part of this Equity Summit to talk about some of these critical issues that are facing us, that are confronting us as teachers, as scholars, as educators, but also as a nation. It really is an honor and pleasure to be able to share some thoughts and ideas with you all, and then to save some time for discussion, for a little virtual conversation. And so we have an hour together, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me for these remarks. And I want to share some ideas and then take it to about 40-45 minutes or so, and then reserve the balance of our time together to field some questions. So there is a question and answer and chat boxes, and if you could, as we go forward, put your questions in there, and then maybe Grace, hopefully you can kind of monitor that and see what pops up, and then towards the end of the hour, you can share those out.
Happy to do that. I'll be happy to do that.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate that. So I've titled my remarks for this afternoon, Seizing the Moment, Teaching Race and Racism Today. Seizing the Moment, Teaching Race and Racism Today. It is obvious to everyone, there's no surprise, it comes as no shock to everyone that we are living in a moment where history is happening. Beginning in late May, following Memorial Day, following the tragic murder of George Floyd, we saw people from around the country taking to the streets under the banner, under the flag of Black Lives Matter, seeking justice in the cases of individual African Americans who have died at the hands of police, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. The list is numerous. The list doesn't just begin in 2020 either. The list extends back years for sure in the immediate moment, and seeking justice for those who have died at the hands of white vigilantes, thinking about Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. And so the thrust of the Black Lives Matter protest, the thrust of the moment, the activism that we are experiencing, that we are witnessing, that we are participating in for many of us, is about seeking justice in these individual cases, but then also seeking justice more broadly, thinking about ways to reform the criminal justice system, thinking about ways to unravel, undo systemic racism, to prevent racial discrimination from continuing forward from this day onward. So the Black Lives Matter protests have been principally about seeking justice, but they have also been about claiming space and claiming the moment, right? Claiming the time in which we actually live. This is a beautiful image of a beautiful mural right down the road from me. I'm in Columbus, Ohio, right down the road from me in Cincinnati, Ohio. And these murals have popped up, some elaborate like this, some more simple, and you've seen them, the yellow paint on the blacktop gravel pavement surface, saying Black Lives Matter. But those murals, these murals are really about claiming the moment, saying that we are going to, those who are taking to the streets, we are going to seize this time, to seize the present, to make it our own. So it's not just about justice, it's also about recognizing the humanity of Black lives, the humanity of Black people, acknowledging the contributions of Black folk. And so it's about claiming the present. And of course, when you claim the present, you're talking about claiming the future. This is about inclusivity. This is about diversity. This is about autonomy and recognizing the contributions of Black folk and people of color. Black Lives Matter is about justice, but it's also about claiming space, claiming the present, acknowledging our presence as African Americans, as people of color in this nation and in this world, in this globe. But the protests are also about reclaiming the past. And this is why we have seen these discussions and protests around taking down, not of course, Confederate monuments, but really reclaiming the past when it comes to how the past is remembered. So here in Columbus, Ohio, there have been moves and movements with some success to remove statues of Christopher Columbus, for example. So we're not just talking about Confederate soldiers and monuments to them. We're talking about all of these figures, all of these memorials that commemorate, that celebrate rather, white supremacy. And so the Black Lives Matter protests are very much about the past as well. And this is critically important because that's where we fall in as educators, particularly those who teach social studies, who teach history. This is a movement very much rooted in the present about establishing and claiming and securing justice, but that has an eye towards the past, which is critically important to understand because this actually has created, and we think about the numbers of what we're seeing, a real opportunity. And I'll say more about that in a second. On July 3rd, 2020, the New York Times released an article, and I encourage everyone to check it out, and use some wonderful infographics that talk about the size of the protests. So we're just not talking about a couple hundred people, a couple thousand people, maybe a couple 100,000 people. We're talking about what is arguably the largest mass protest in the history of the United States. These surveys, and there's a range between 15 million and 26 million people protesting in early June, literally on one day, that far surpasses anything that we have ever seen before. The March on Washington had 250,000 people, and we're talking about that 50 years later. The largest protest during the Civil Rights era was a school boycott that actually occurred in New York in February of 1964, just a few months after the March on Washington, and that had 400,000 people. The Women's March had a couple million, one day, one place, highly organized. We're talking about 26 million people on the high end, 15 million on the low end, and that's just for a few days. This goes on for several months. So we're talking about the largest protest in US history. And what does that mean? That means it has created an opportunity for us as educators to teach and to talk about not only the present, not only because the people who are taken to the streets, the young people in particular who are taken to the streets, are interested in the present and claiming their space and ownership of the present and seeking justice, but also this opportunity to teach about the past. Now, if we're going to do that, if we're going to seize this opportunity, seize this moment, born of tragedy, born of death, born of murder, born of the absence of justice, if we're going to take that tragedy and turn it into a teaching opportunity to talk about and teach about honestly, frankly, candidly, and effectively race and racism, then the starting point for that, no matter the age group that we are dealing with, whether it's college, as in my instance, as in my case, or high school or middle school, or even elementary school, pre-K and K, the starting point for this conversation, for teaching about race and racism, is the notion and making sure our students and kids understand that race itself is not real, that race biologically is meaningless. There is no fundamental difference between anybody who is watching this and on this Zoom call presentation right now. There is no biological difference of any significance when it comes to what we consider to be race. Our DNA is fundamentally the same. There is no difference in that sense. Race as a construct, as a scientific construct, is meaningless. It's a fiction. It's a fabrication. Race isn't real. This is the starting point, because when you drop that on your students, they're like, wait a minute, you mean like all this stuff that we've been thinking about is just made up? Like, absolutely, it's just made up. It is a fabrication. There is no biological significant difference between anybody in any classroom, anywhere in America or anywhere in the world. But although race is biologically meaningless, race is socially meaningful. And this is an important distinction. Biologically meaningless, but socially meaningful, meaning that for the last 500 years of world history, and certainly for the entirety of American history, race has been used to create hierarchy in society. Race is principally the reason why we see divisions in society as they relate to the creation of caste systems, as it relate to economic hierarchies. So race, biologically meaningless, but socially meaningful, because it has created the hierarchies that have structured our society. At the same time, race is culturally relevant. So it's biologically meaningless, ain't no difference between our DNA. Socially meaningful, we are living in a world that is stratified based upon race, but it's also culturally relevant, meaning that we use race, certainly in the American context, we use race as a stand-in, as a fill-in for cultural inheritance. We use race as a stand-in for ancestry. And that's really important because when we're talking about race, what we are really talking about is people's culture. What we're talking about is people's ancestry, people's heritage. And that's why we just simply can't ignore it. You know, the problem with race in our society is not that we categorize people by it, although it really has no scientific meaning. Again, we use it as a fill-in for cultural ancestry. The problem is that we use race to discriminate. And that's the issue. Like, recognizing people by race isn't a problem. Discriminating against people because of their race is the problem. And because race is culturally relevant for the time being and into the foreseeable future, because we use race as this fill-in for cultural ancestry and cultural heritage, we have to avoid, when we're teaching about race and racism, we have to avoid the colorblind trap. It is insufficient in this world, in this day and age, to pretend that we don't see race, because of course we do. Children, infants, as young as 3 months and 4 months old, psychologists tell us that they are able to distinguish people and identify people by race because they're picking up on the signals and the cues of their parents and their caregivers. So we see race. The only people who say they don't see race are the people who are pretending that they don't. And again, seeing race isn't a problem. Discriminating against people based upon race is a problem. You know, I often, before this moment, I used to fly quite a lot, and I don't, you know, it is what it is now. But I would often hop on a plane, and I'll sit next to somebody, and if I was dressed for a presentation or so, a nice, you know, white guy or white lady would come sit by and say, "Oh, you know, what do you do?" You know, in between my little sips of, you know, Coca-Cola or whatever. You know, I'll say, well, you know, I teach African American history. Oh, you know, let me tell you about my one black friend, my one black cousin, and how I'm colorblind and I don't see race. And it's like, yeah, all right, now, you know, I'm just gonna turn away and put my headphones back on because I don't really need to be a part of this conversation because it ain't going nowhere. Because of course you see race. Stop pretending that you don't, right? And when you say you don't see race, what you are in fact doing is erasing me. Like, I need you to see who I am. Because when you see my race, what you're actually doing is acknowledging my parents. You're acknowledging my grandparents. You're acknowledging the struggle of my enslaved ancestors. Don't erase that to make yourself feel comfortable about the past and about the present. Acknowledge that, right? Because I'm proud that they survived the horrors of slavery and Jim Crow. Because if it wasn't for them and the experiences that they endured and the way in which they were able to find a way to survive, I wouldn't be here sitting next to you on this plane trying to pretend that I don't hear you. So we have to avoid the colorblind trap in the classroom as well. We can't run from it. We have to be very specific and willing to address racism in the classroom. Well, if race isn't real, racism for sure as heck is real. And we have to be sure to explain that to our students as well. And this is before you get into any specifics, before you start talking about the history, you got to talk about the ideas and notions that race isn't real, but racism, in fact, is very real. And when we talk about racism, and when we get to those points, we have to be clear that our students understand that racism will manifest itself in two ways. So we'll be talking about two types. The first is the personal, the prejudicial beliefs and behaviors of individuals. This is sort of the racist actions, using the N-word, all this other stuff, right? It's what individuals do. And we still live with that. But that isn't the full extent of racism, or rather of how racism manifests itself. Racism also manifests itself in structural ways, the ways in which prejudice is embedded in the systems and structures of our society. And when we're talking about racism, we're talking about prejudice embedded in systems and structures. Of course, any kind of prejudice can be embedded in systems and structures. I understand that, that's clear. But when we're talking about race and racism, what we're actually talking about specifically is white supremacy. And I'll say a little bit more about the use of our language and the need to be explicit. But this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the ideas of white supremacy, the belief in white supremacy, and white supremacy being this belief that people of European descent are both biologically, again, which is really made up, it's a fiction, as well as culturally superior to people of African descent. And so when we're talking about racism, it is important to be as clear and specific as possible. We're not only talking about these personal and structural manifestations, but we're also talking about the ideology of white supremacy, which undergird and justify the institution of slavery and was its principal legacy, and is what we're actually dealing with now, that manifests itself in these prejudicial behaviors of individuals, but also in discriminatory structures and systems in our society. So what do we do when we're thinking about putting race and racism in historical context? Why do we even need to be talking about this? Is this something that we're just seeing manifested today in an unfortunate way? Is it something that has existed in the past that we're now over? The reality is, when we're talking about race and we're talking about America and racism in particular, race has been with us from the beginning. So has racism in terms of this American journey, this American project. In fact, racism is very much encoded in our DNA. Racism and capitalism together are really that double helix of our DNA. They are intertwined. They have been with us from the beginning. They are encoded in our society. They are encoded in our person. That is why we can't ignore it. That is why we have to deal with it, not only in the past, but also in the present. And what does this look like? Let me just think about this for a second. We're talking about racism driving and justifying the colonial project, settler colonialism, racism driving slavery, racism driving Jim Crow. That's 350 years of our history. Now look, slavery is an economic system. Jim Crow was an economic system. Colonialism was driven by economics. All this is driven by economics. We got to be clear about that. But racism is what provides the justification. Racism provides the rationale, and it is consistent. So yeah, in 1865, we finally overcome slavery. We end slavery, but we don't end racism. We don't overcome racism. We don't overcome white supremacy. 1965, 64, 65, then the height of the civil rights movement, we finally get some major legislation, 64 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, that will end formal segregation, legalized segregation. But that doesn't end racism. That doesn't end white supremacy. That's part of that legacy. It continues on. And we have to be clear about that because that's what we're dealing with. And of course, over the last 50 years, if you just take another example of us continuing to live with this, all we have to do is look at the criminal justice system. This is why you have millions of people taken to the streets now, because they're wrestling with the problems of racism that get manifested through the criminal justice system. Last 50 years dealing with the war on drugs and dealing with mass incarceration. So it's not simply a police problem. We do have a police problem. We have a policing problem, but that is connected to the priorities of this nation. This emphasis for the last 50 years on this thing called the war on drugs, leading to mass incarceration. And of course, you don't get mass incarceration unless you get mass arrests, hence the centrality of the police in this whole system over the last 50 years. And that's just dealing with criminal justice. We haven't said anything about education and the way in which education is racialized, and we're still dealing with segregation in education, as well as uneven and disproportionate sharing of resources. So racism encoded in our DNA from the very beginning as a nation and still with us today. So we have no choice but to deal with it and talk about it if we want to deal with the past in a frank and honest way. And when we're thinking and preparing to teach about race and racism, it's important that we understand it as what I call hard history. When we look at the American journey, the American enterprise, when it comes to questions of race and racism, subjects of race and racism, where race and racism intersect with with events and with people. This is what I call hard history in the American experience. It's hard history because it is literally hard to think about, especially when you begin to think about a subject like slavery, for example, or Jim Crow, segregation, that what was undergirding it, right? Like violence is the cornerstone of slavery. So we have to, this American journey begins with people taking other people's land and taking other people's freedom, right? Like we have to wrap our minds around what that means and how that impacts people going forward. Race and racism as hard history. Look, we are conditioned. We have been told that race and racism are the things that we don't talk about. It's the third rail of polite conversation. And if you don't believe me, next time, listen to how somebody literally talks about race when you're in conversation, right? It's like, oh, you know, so-and-so, yeah, he's white. And it's like the whisper, oh, they're black. I'm like, why are you whispering? I'm right here. What's going on? Because we're told not to talk about it because it makes us uncomfortable, right? And so we have to get comfortable with our discomfort. We literally can't even talk about it. Now, if we can't talk about it in polite conversation, how the heck are we going to teach about it, right? Race and racism as hard history. And because we have this reluctance to talk about it, we don't want to talk about the violence. We don't want to talk about the privileges that have been extended. We don't want to talk about the oppression. We don't talk about the lives lost, the land stolen. It becomes hard to teach about it, right? Because we've been so conditioned not to talk about it. We've been so conditioned to ignore it that when it comes time to teach it in the classroom, either we're not ready because we haven't learned it, or we're uncomfortable as teachers because we're not sure how our students are going to take it, or how their parents, our administrators, or our community are going to respond to it. So there are real obstacles to being able to teach hard history. And then lastly, it's hard to learn about. We have made it difficult for our children to learn hard history, right? Because especially at the younger grades, because we don't teach it, because we don't talk about it in any real or systematic way, we lose this opportunity to actually educate our children. And so, look, you have elementary school students. I love elementary age kids. I can't teach them. I ain't got the patience, but I love them nonetheless because they are sponges. They are open, right? We talk about race and racism when I go into the fourth grade class or so, and they're like, okay, talk to me about it. These 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, they're not uncomfortable talking about race and racism. You talk to them about it all day. We're the ones who are uncomfortable about it. And because of our discomfort, we project that onto them, which then makes it hard for them to actually learn about this important history. So what happens? Because we don't want to deal with hard history, how do we respond? Well, we respond in 3 ways. First, we have what I call purposeful historical amnesia. We just pretend that stuff ain't happened, right? We just pretend that slavery didn't exist in the North. We just pretend that convict leasing during the Jim Crow era just didn't occur. We pretend that racial terrorism in America just didn't happen. That there was no Tulsa, right? There was no series of lynchings between 1890, several thousand African Americans, 1890 and 1950. We just pretend it doesn't happen, and that's not just the remote past, right? That's also the present. We just pretend that stuff doesn't happen. Right now, on average, police, and this ties back into the moment in which we're living, on average, about 300, by best estimates, over the last decade, every year, about 1,000 people in America are killed by police, die at the hands of the police. And of those numbers, about 350, on average, best estimates, die at the hands of the police every year. 350 African Americans die at the hands of the police every year. This is over the last 10 years. And that's been going down, right? But 350. That is 3 times as many African Americans that were killed by lynch mobs during the height of lynching at the turn of the 20th century. So not only do we get this historical amnesia about the past, we don't waste a lot of time before we forget about the stuff that's happening in the present. Historical amnesia. We also, in our response to hard history, we also attempt to rationalize evil. We rationalize evil. We think about the institution of slavery, for example, and when you talk to people about the founders of the nation, the framers of the Constitution, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, and we talk about them as claiming ownership over people, as enslavers, then what's the response that people give you? You can ask any docent at any of these plantation sites, they'll tell you, you talk about slavery, you mention them, and then the first question that folk will ask is, well, weren't they good masters? Weren't they good people? You can't be a good master. That's an oxymoron. It doesn't work, right? It's only worse and worse, right? If you are people in bondage and you ain't setting nobody free, you bad, right? Period. But that's an attempt to rationalize evil. We also rationalize evil by talking about, they were just people of their time, right? They ain't know any better, right? George Wallace and Jim Clark in the civil rights era, George Washington, always, they were just people of their time, right? The only way, that's an attempt to rationalize evil, rationalize their action. They didn't know any better. Of course they knew better. The only way that you can actually say that with a straight face is if you discount the presence of the millions of Black folk who were there who felt quite differently about the situation, right? And if you don't want to talk about the Black people who were there, who knew better, then you can look at all of their friends. Jefferson, Madison, Washington, they all had boys. They're running partners who they used to sit in their little libraries and their little dining rooms sipping tea, who told them that what they were doing was wrong and that there would be a price to pay for it, right? So we have to stop rationalizing evil. And then finally, we got to stop just creating these false narratives, just making stuff up, right? Because that's the other thing we do. We just make stuff up. We done made up the whole lost cause, right? Rewrote history completely, right? That's just making stuff up. Looking at the North and slavery in the North, right? Pretending that every white person in the North, and I'm originally from New York City, so I know this narrative well. Like every white person in New York or the North was an abolitionist, was opposed to slavery, was always on the right side of history. That's just making stuff up. You're just making stuff up, right? And so that's one of our usual responses to creating to hard history, right? Ways to avoid dealing with the past. So what can we do? What should we do about this? I got some ideas. One, we got to teach history. So rather than the usual response to hard history, what we have to do is actually teach history. Now you say, all right, this is the National Council for History Education. What do you mean teach history? Look, we're not living in a bubble. We're not teaching in a bubble. And we know over the last 20 years, last 2 decades, there has been a hard push away from teaching the humanities, right? And a hard emphasis on STEM and on testing. And as a result, we have fallen away. We have marginalized teaching history, teaching social studies. And you say, well, all right, that's unfortunate. No, it's more than just unfortunate. Because what social studies, what history, what the humanities does is teach people how to be people, right? Which is more than you get just teaching science and technology, right? You got to teach people how to be people, about the past and about the present, about other communities, other cultures, other societies. Like that's critical. And history is the entry point for doing that. And so we have to teach history. We have to teach truth. It's not enough, or it's no good if you're going to teach history and it's the same old normative narrative of the American past, right? We have to teach truth. And you say, well, what is truth? Is there? No, the truth is truth. You know what the hell I'm talking about, right? You got to teach truth. Slavery was not a necessary evil. Slavery was evil, right? That's teaching truth. That's critically important that we do that. And as educators, we got to put our foot down, and we have to be willing to stand up to those who want to inject narratives that simply are false. We have to push back against myths and misconceptions that actually do more harm. As teachers, we don't take a Hippocratic oath. Physicians take that. But we are bound by the same principle. In the Hippocratic oath, it says, do no harm. And if we do not teach truth, if we continue to miseducate, then we are in fact doing harm, because we're not preparing our children to make the tough decisions about inequality in the future that they're going to be asked to do. What to do? We got to teach resistance. We got to teach resistance to racism. We got to teach resistance to white supremacy. We got to teach resistance to inequality. That means teaching resistance to slavery. That means teaching resistance to Jim Crow. That means teaching resistance to racial terrorism in the present. It is absolutely essential. And this is actually the starting point, the point of entry, because resistance, when you teach resistance, you're actually allowing people, young kids, you're allowing children, students, to find a point of commonality. Because in their minds, when faced with oppression, they for themselves would say, well, why would I push back? I would push back, right? Not knowing context and the like, they would push back. So when you lead with resistance, you're holding up a mirror and saying, you know what? People did what you thought they should do. Now, it looks different. They do it in different ways, but by all means, they do it. And when you teach resistance, you're actually teaching humanity. You're pushing away from victimhood and you're dealing with agency. Now, there's time enough to talk about the systems and structures and oppression. There's time enough to genuinely talk about the ways in which racism creates victims. It takes people's lives. That's that hard history of violence. And we'll get there. But lead with the humanity, because everything else in the world denies humanity to Black folk and people of color. So you have to find ways to lead with it, and resistance does just that. And then lastly, you got to teach today. We can't be afraid of talking about the present. We can't stop history and teaching history and social studies 50 years ago. We can't pull a William Jefferson Clinton the other day and throw Black power under the bus. And so we call Michael Kwame too, Ray. We have to teach through today. You know, I used to, I can't play anymore. I'm getting a little bit too old. But I used to play baseball and pitch and play football. But if you're a pitcher, you got to follow through. You can't just throw a ball and then stop right here, right? That's what we're doing. We're stopping right here in 1965. We got to follow through. Bring your elbow all the way through so that ball will hit the catcher, will go over the plate. That's what we got to do. We got to teach through today. Now, you can teach backwards. You can start today and come forward. But whatever you do, you got to make sure you teach through today. So now, how do we do it? And this is my last slide, and then I'll wrap up, and we'll save some time on the back end for some questions and for comments. So how do we do it? That's what we have to do. How do we do it? I offer you what I call the 7 Bs. Now, this is not getting into content. This is how do we approach this content. 7 Bs to teaching race and racism. The first one, you got to be clear, right? You got to be clear when it comes to language, right? So what language are you using? How are you talking about race? Again, race is biologically meaningless, but culturally meaningful. You got to be clear. Language counts. Now, if you're dealing with history in particular, one of the ways we have to teach it honestly, accurately, and effectively is to introduce primary source material, primary sources. Teach kids to be historians. But part of being a historian is also being able to interpret and read this material. And there's language in that material that is problematic. There's language in that material that is offensive. And so we have to not only provide context, we have to explain to our students the meaning of language, the meaning of terms, and we also have to know how and when to use it. I was just in a workshop earlier today, in fact, and we were talking about sort of terms to use and how do you use it. And, you know, terms like Negro and Negro wench that you find in census records and stuff like this. And it's like, look, we have to teach our kids to be historically bilingual. And by that, I mean, they can see something, they can read it on the page, but then in their mind, they have to make the translation. Oh, they're not talking about some random group of Negroes. They're talking about people who are African-Americans, people of African descent, right? So we have to teach them how to do those translations. And we also have to use language that humanizes. So if we're talking about slavery, we stop talking about slaves and we talk about enslaved people, recognizing their humanity. If we're talking about those who we call slave owners and slave masters, those who are enslaving others, we need to stop using that language and talk about enslavers, their active role in maintaining people in bondage. And then lastly, on this language thing, we got to stop across the board using the N-word, period. In the classroom, got to stop it, right? If it's in books, if it's in the material that we're using, students can read it. They can read it mentally, make that translation in their mind. All right, I know what I'm talking about, but we're not going to verbalize it. This isn't censorship. I'm an ACLU dude. I don't believe in censorship. But I also understand that when we come into the classroom, that we carry all of the cultural baggage from outside inside. And what I know from talking to students, from listening to students talk about this stuff, is that when they're in the classroom, and even, the very nice, white teacher, polite teacher who's very nice to them, right? They don't necessarily know their history. You could have the white teacher who's been an activist for 50 years.
The kids in there like, man, I don't know your history. I don't know where you're coming from. You put a little bit too much emphasis on that R as you were reading it. You don't, it's just no reason to go there. And also we know that white students in these classrooms as well will at times use that as permission to use that word outside of the classroom in a derogatory fashion. So the best bet is just don't use it. It's okay. You'll survive without it. Everybody knows what we're talking about. In our classrooms, we have to set the boundaries for what is acceptable, for what is permissible. And we know that in our classes, there are students, particularly when we start talking about race and racism, there are students who we have to protect. And this is one of the ways we protect our students of color. But there's also students that we have to correct. And you have to be willing to do that. Too many times I hear students talk about, well, you know, I know the teacher heard the student, my classmate, use the N-word, but they just turned around and pretended like they didn't hear it. That stuff gotta stop, right? We have to take control in our classrooms, especially when it comes to language. It's critical that we be positive. We're talking about race, talking about racism, not being positive about racism. We're talking about race in particular. You're talking about African Americans and people of color. You gotta be positive in the classroom because we're negative outside of the classroom. That's part of what this Black Lives Matter movement is pushing, right? Pushing this notion of a positive race consciousness, not only for African Americans to see themselves and children of color to see themselves positively, but also so that white kids can see black kids, white people can see black people in a positive light. So how do we do that? We do that not only by putting material that we're reading into proper context, but also by supplementing and complementing it, making sure that we are not only reading and teaching literature and sources from a white perspective, but also or from right authors, but very much as well, and equally so, represented from Black authors. When our kids walk into our classroom, what are the images that are on the walls? What are the posters? What are the signs? Like all of that is messaging to our children about how they should be thinking about race, how they should be thinking about people of other cultural backgrounds. And so we have to be positive. We can't always be negative, because one thing we will do, and I know this from personal experience, not in the classroom, but really dealing with my children themselves. If we just talk about the horrors, if we just talk about the negativity, if we just talk about the pain of Blackness, the pain of what it means to exist in this world as a person of color, then the children don't want to have anything to do with it. They push back, and we don't want that. We want to have a positive race consciousness, right? So that means focusing on the positive, not ignoring the negative, but making sure that we focus and emphasize the positive. We have to be open. I am very much a civil rights scholar as well. And one of the people I look to and study and admire greatly is Ella Baker, veteran activist from the NAACP, SCLC advisor for a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And as she went into communities, her mantra was start where the people are. And that applies to us in the classroom too. We have to start where the students are. That means not assuming what they know, not assuming what they think, but actually asking them what they think, asking them what they think they know, and starting there. Because they'll be in different places, right? But we have to know where they are so that we can decide and determine what is the best point of entry for dealing with these subjects. What do they think they know about slavery? What do they think they know about the Confederacy? What do they think they know about civil rights and Martin Luther King? What do they think they know about the George Floyd protests? Figure out where they are, and then use that as the point of entry. And the only way you can do that is if we ask the students themselves. We have to be open to their questions. Now, their questions may be framed a little funny, they may be framed a little funky, they actually may be framed offensively. This is where you gotta be in control of that classroom and know those students where you gotta protect, where you gotta jump in, and also the students who you have to correct. You gotta be personal. And this is especially important when talking about race and racism for white educators and white teachers. You got to share your story. And being personal, look, you don't got to go through your whole life history, right? But you do have to, in critical ways, share that, look, you don't have all the answers. You're figuring this out too, right? You came up through the same educational system, so I guarantee you didn't always know this stuff. You're learning it too. Like, that is critically important, right? And that you have made mistakes. You believe you held certain assumptions that were false, that were rooted in stereotypes, that you are essentially no different than they are. But you also are going to help them move forward as you move forward in figuring out how to make sense of the world in which we live in and how to make sense of this history. That is really empowering, not only for you as an educator, but also for the students themselves. And this also means not just what you didn't know about Black folk and people of color, this also means what you didn't know about yourself and how you identify. How many times have you, just think about this, as a teacher, gone to a classroom over over the course of your career and actually told the students, gave voice to the students about your racial identity and actually said, hey, by the way, I'm white, right? I guarantee you most of you haven't, because I ask people all the time. It's like, just go into the classroom, say you're white. Like, what do you mean say I'm white? Say you're white, right? You know you're white. I know you're white. They know you're white. Say you're white, right? By doing that, that actually gives the students permission to talk specifically and openly about race and racial identity. We can't ask them to talk about stuff that we ourselves aren't modeling and talking about it. Now look, as an African-American, I don't necessarily have that problem. As soon as I walk into a classroom at Ohio State with 200 students in a US history class and 190 of them are white, I don't have to proclaim my Blackness, right? That becomes clear and apparent as soon as I begin speaking at the microphone, right? But that's a different issue. I got different issues I got to wrestle with because they ain't never had a Black person in a position of authority. But here, the stating of racial identity becomes really important. And the way to do that, in part, is by being personal. You got to be explicit in what we're talking about. Don't dance around the edges, not dealing with this colorblindness. Talk specifically about the personal manifestations of racism, but then also the structural. That will help them understand the moment that we are in and the differences that they are. We can't dance around the edges, right? And that also means how we talk about the past. Right? We're talking about slavery and never actually identifying enslavers. We celebrate President's Day for kids. Kids are celebrating President's Day from their birth until in Ohio in the 8th grade, when finally we talk about American history, and then we want to talk about enslavers, and you tell them that Jefferson and Madison and Washington were enslavers. And they're like, wait a minute, I've been shopping on their holiday for the last 12 years. You're telling me that these aren't good dudes? And like, I'm telling you that they were enslavers. And so we gotta talk about explicitly what we're talking about and who we're talking about and what is it in fact that they are doing. We have to be intentional, last 2 points. We have to be intentional when talking and teaching about race and racism in the classroom. And being intentional means that, when we go into our classes and we're thinking about, we're planning out our school year, that we don't, that we map out how we're going to introduce this, when we're going to introduce this, when we're going to circle back to these questions, what subjects will serve as our key points of entry to talk about questions of personal racism, personal prejudice, but then also the structural stuff, right? You don't want to reserve it for one particular moment in time. We're not saving it just for February. February is about highlighting the African-American experience and contribution, but we need to be talking about that race encoded in our DNA from the first day we walk into class. And especially now, that's the opportunity, because our kids want to know whether that is in person or virtual. Hopefully it'll be virtual given the situation and circumstance. We got to tell our kids, look, we recognize all the stuff that has been going on during the summer, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to keep talking about it, and we're going to refer back to it whenever we need to and whenever you want to. That scaffolding, right? Building and layering as we move through the year. But the scaffolding also has to be as we move through grades. We got to be teaching and talking about, we got to be teaching this stuff to our youngest kids, right? Preschool and kindergarten kids understand notions of fairness and equality, power, but we introduce that to them, but we don't introduce how that relates to society, how that relates to race, and race is formative in their experience. So we absolutely have to do that. And we have to introduce these concepts in the earliest grades and then build on them, just like we do just like we do with mathematics, just like we do with science. We don't wait to teach addition and subtraction until we get to high school and they're trying to learn calculus, because that fails. There's no way they can get it. We need to do the same thing when we talk about race and racism in historical context, building on from the earliest grades going forward, scaffold up, but then also scaffold vertically. So vertically build up through the grades, but then also horizontally, so that there's not just in social studies, but it's also in English, language arts, music, art, and the like, so that it's across the curriculum. And then finally, last point, we got to be proactive, right? And being proactive means that we just don't confine our instruction and teaching to the classroom, that we also extend it out to the community. It has to be about the classroom, teaching in the classroom, but then also teaching in the community. And we have to think about, especially given what we're seeing occurring on the streets today, this is a community trying to figure out, community being a nation, trying to figure out in this moment of racial reckoning, how do we move forward? And we can only move forward if we understand where we are, and we can only understand where we are if we understand where we have come from and what the past is. No one, and then, community engagement can get a little tricky depending upon what community that you're talking about. And we know for a fact that tends to, especially around race and racism, there will tend to be pushback from both corners. Black folk who are like, look, y'all have done such a horrible job of teaching about race, and y'all want to do it now. Let me know how you're going to do this. You got to have community engagement there. But then also from white communities, right? But white parents who are like, oh, are you just trying to guilt my children? Like, no. Nobody is guilty or responsible for anything that has occurred in the past. And nobody's putting that blame on your children's shoulders. They're not even responsible for the stuff that's happening today, but they are responsible for the future. And it is our obligation. We are duty bound to prepare them for that. And the way in which we do that is by teaching them about the past in truthful and honest ways. It is not easy, it is difficult, but it's something that we absolutely have to do. And so with that, I will pause there. We have a few minutes. Talk a little long. I apologize, but I'll be happy to maybe take a couple questions. We have time for some questions. I'm glad to take those now.
So there was a number of questions dealing with how to handle the use of students using the N-word, African American students who use it, or they use the word without the hard R, and just how to parents saying that they're allowed to or whatever. So they were just asking how you recommended that be handled.
Yeah. So I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little older now, but I also know that there is language, having grown up in the Baptist church, grown up in the Black community, there's language that I use with my boys in the street, and there's a language that I use when I was around my grandparents and my parents at home and in professional spaces. And that's part of that being bilingual, right? So I am very much of the mind that in the classroom, nope, I don't care, soft A, hard R, nothing, off the table. And that doesn't mean if it comes out, because we know it's part of the common, it's used in the common, used frequently, right? Like if it comes out, we're not arresting children in the classroom, but we are establishing that no, this is not where we're going. This is you have to be able to be conversant in these different spaces. And this is one of the spaces where we're not doing it, period. Full stop, right? So I'm like, look, no, this is not the place for it. It creates too many complications. That doesn't matter if you're white, absolutely not. If you're Black, absolutely not too. You got to be able to be conversant as well, right? And until something changes outside, though, that's where I think we should be on the inside.
So that would also include literature such as Frederick Douglass, the narrations of narratives of slavery.
Exactly. You can have it in the text, but I am not saying we do not vocalize it. You can read over it. It's not that complicated. When you come across the subject and you're reading publicly, or have our students read silently, you don't have to read the passages out loud, right? They can read, right? Then you simply skip over it. We don't have to look, the narrative of Frederick Douglass is so powerful. We absolutely have to have it in there. But this is that being bilingual again, in terms of historical context. We haven't earned the right as a society to use that language in the classroom and it not be, because when we use it, we know that there are still harmful effects, right? That we're unclear about, well, what are people's intent, right? So that, for that reason alone, until we get to a different place where it doesn't create offense, it doesn't traumatize, and it isn't trivializing, then we're better off just staying away from it.
Okay, another question has to do with your reaction to Tom Cotton's recent statements and how schools can combat this when legislators like him are constantly threatening to remove funding if American exceptionalism is not the focus of standards.
Well, this is where I'm saying that we have to stand firm on truth. We absolutely have to stand firm on truth. The history and education has always been political, so there's always going to be politics. But the thing is, when we're talking about what we're talking about. We're talking about teaching slavery honestly and effectively, teaching about Jim Crow, teaching about American history. Like, we actually have the truth on our side, right? Like, Tom Cotton is just making stuff up. He's trying to get votes. He's pandering to racism. We actually have the truth on our side. So this isn't even debatable, right? There are real world consequences. I understand that, for us as educators who are committed to teaching history truthfully and honestly. Now, we can debate interpretation, but we can't debate sort of centrality and some certain basic things. We can't debate that. We can't allow that debate to occur. And we can't allow them to suddenly say, like, well, you know, I don't think it's too complicated, so we're not going to deal with it. Like, that's not an option either. The consequences are real, yeah. But you know what? There's also real consequences for all those kids who are out in the street, who are protesting against systemic racism, kids who have given up their lives, right? And who have really suffered. And we owe it to them to do our part. Like they're on the front lines. We owe it to them to give them that support in the classroom and to teach them what they need to understand the world in which they live.
Okay, there's also several questions related to suggestions you might have for curriculum, examples of monographs that would be must-reads for AP US, or how you might scaffold the teaching of this, or how to handle with a lot of teachers having to go virtual and teach over Zoom. How can you teach hard history over Zoom in a secondary setting, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so no, absolutely. I think especially relevant for the Zoom era, for the virtual era of teaching, is that we need to rely a little bit more on documentary films and sort of multimedia. We can, in this moment in particular, because we know this is a digital age, we're raising the digital generation. And I came to that realization a few years ago in my classes, where I realized that, man, it was easier for me to get students to watch 4 hours of documentary film on Netflix than it was to get them to read for 20 minutes from a textbook, right? So let's use that to our advantage, especially during this moment. And think about, and we're, especially over the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, there are phenomenal documentary films on all of the subjects that intersect with race and racism, whether we're talking about films on documentaries on slavery, on civil rights era, on literally race, right? The race, the power of illusion, a four-part documentary on the construction of race. So, I mean, without going into the depth of detail, and certainly I can share some resources, and by all means, you know, sort of shoot me a note or something. But thinking about documentary films, thinking about what's available, because a lot of material is available online through PBS and through our own educational resources, like Canopy, for example. Think about how to supplement that work, because I guarantee you will get students who will be much more engaged in that film than they will be in looking at a PowerPoint slide and 4 particular points that you're putting up there.
Okay, there's quite a few, and we'll go a few minutes over if we need to, and I'll put in the survey, because I would encourage you all to complete the survey, and there is an opportunity for everyone to receive a free receive a half price on our NCHE membership by using the code SUMMIT as a promo. But I wanted to get that in before we got, some people might have to leave at 8 o'clock. So there's questions about dealing with people who, a parent community that believes that, you know, it's white erasure if you're adding Black history, and they're committed to the inevitable progress narrative, mistakes in the past, don't focus on the blemishes. How do you deal with that?
Well, here, I mean, I think it's the same thing, right? This is dealing with sort of, you know, Senator Tom Cotton, right? We have to stand firm on our ground, right? And we have to be strategic about it. So point one is you got to go forward with it, right? So it's not an option to say, well, maybe I won't do it because it creates too many ripples or too many waves. Like, that is not even an option. So what do we say? How do you think, how do we approach it strategically? I think one of the critical things that we need to do, you can do as educators, and this is where the community engagement comes in, is you got to reach out to your parents before you even begin, right? Beginning of the semester, beginning of the school year. These are the topics that we're covering, and this is why we're going to cover it, right? And I guarantee you will find, right, even in the most conservative districts, you will find parents who will be like, you know what, thank you very much, right? And when the time comes where you have a handful who may bristle and push back and say, oh, you're teaching this, you will also have parents who will come to your aid, right? And who will come to your side and your defense and be like, you know what, no, this isn't a surprise. This is exactly what they told me my child was going to be learning, and I want them to learn it. So that bringing the community into the classroom, if you will, I think is a critical strategy for teachers individually, but really for school districts, for schools, for administrators, for getting that support, that community support that you need to push back against those who don't want to deal with historical reality, who don't want to deal with the hard history of the past because they don't want to deal with the hard history of the present.
Some of the teachers were asking about sharing some of the points on your PowerPoint. Is that available to the teachers? Would we be able to share that with them? Or?
Yeah, no, certainly. I'll make the slide deck available to you all.
Okay, great. And just the idea of, oh, and also it was asked if your contact information, I think you had it on the last slide, but I didn't get it written down. So,
yeah, I could put
so,
it
and just wondering if there were specific readings or resources that they could direct their students to look at to understand the Black Lives Matter movement. They want to start the school year with current events and would love to hear about resources if you had some ideas on that.
Well, I think depending upon the age of the student, you know, they're living through the Black Lives Matter movement, right, in the current moment. So there are. I'm actually teaching a course this here at Ohio State this year on the last 50 years of the African American experience, and I'm actually teaching it backwards. And the first day of class is going to be the first thing, whatever's in the news that day. I think that's a great way to sort of begin to walk back. If you're thinking about talking and teaching about the Black Lives Matter movement, there are books, I think, from Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation by Keonga Taylor is a valuable book. How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning. And we'll share these out. Stamped from the Beginning, the children's edition, young people's edition is a wonderful book. But I'm actually thinking about too, I'm teaching a civil rights course as well, thinking about the ways in which the present connects to the past. And what this means is actually starting and sharing on the first day with the powerful letter, the love letter to American youth, written by John Lewis, published posthumously on the day of his funeral. This is just such a powerful statement about the present, about the past, and about future possibilities. And if we're going to talk about what this moment is about, and it's complicated, of course, but I think that is a great way, a great starting point, because it is the equivalent of Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. I mean, it is that powerful, that gracefully written and contains those kinds of powerful truths that I think our kids would need to hear and would prompt questions that we need to hear from them.
I couldn't agree more. That's a great source. And I'm afraid we're out of time. I did have one last, somebody asked if you were on John Oliver on Sunday.
Yes. So yes, I was. They didn't tell me. I had been talking to the producers, and I think actually that is an absolute wonderful, you know, I mean, it's a little, somebody asked me, well, you gonna show your mom? I was like, I can't show my mom that. It's a little bit too colorful. But they did a segment on teaching history and teaching American history, really teaching hard history, right? And John Oliver, of course, on HBO is always a little colorful. But for us, at least, it is really a wonderful segment. And they did a full segment. I didn't know they were going that long, and I didn't know they were going to put that little clip of me in there. But it is good, it is powerful, and yes, it is me. And yes, students in Ohio suffer from Underground Railroaditis, thinking everybody who was white now would have been supporting abolition then, and that's not the truth. So it's a wonderful piece on how to deconstruct, or the need to deconstruct these false narratives, so we can actually understand what we're dealing with, not only in the past, but also the present.
Thank you so much, Hasan. It was terrific, and I really appreciate your time. And for all of you, please take the time to complete our survey, and we hope you'll join if you're not already a member of NCHE. We offer the rest of the summit for the next 2 days. We have some great sessions, so please be sure and attend those. And thank you again. Good night.
Thanks so much. And good luck to everyone.